Hey guys, today we're covering how to build a nonprofit logic model and how it is going to contribute to really effective and successful marketing campaigns. If your organization could benefit from more donors, partners, and clients, then this framework is actually going to really help you clarify who you should be talking to, the messaging that you should be using to speak to them, and the tools and strategies that you should prioritize to make sure that your campaigns are successful. So today, in addition to walking you through an example nonprofit logic model, at the end of this video as a bonus, I'm actually going to give you a link to the tools that we use with our clients to build out their logic models and generate big successes in their marketing campaigns. So let's hop right in. So I just want to start off by asking you a question. You ever feel like you and your team have a million different plates in the air and people are running around with their hair on fire, don't know what to prioritize for their day? This exercise is actually going to help. By mapping out your logic model, you're going to have a clearer understanding of what is important and what is not important for your day-to-day success and overall strategy success. Imagine how good it's going to feel when you can say, no, that's not important for my day, or no, that's not important this month, because you have clarity around what you are trying to achieve. With a logic model, that is going to be the case. So let's just talk a little bit really briefly about what a logic model is. So at the simplest level, a logic model is a way to map out your organization's inputs, outputs, and outcomes that are associated with your business. And you're saying to yourself, well, great, so what does that even mean? All right, Andrew? Well, for this exercise, I created a fictitious organization that we can use as an example so that you get a little bit of a better understanding of how inputs, outputs, and outcomes are related. I'm calling my fictitious organization Cleanup and Restoration Team, or CART for short. CART's a volunteer-driven environmental cleanup and restoration organization that uses volunteer labor to clean up locations that have been left polluted by industrial companies. With volunteer crews, they clean up these organizations and restore them using native species of plants. In addition to looking at what inputs are required for CART, we're going to look at also what metrics they should be tracking so that they can generate more effective marketing messaging that's going to help them build out better campaigns. So right now you're saying to yourself, okay, but how is this going to make me a better nonprofit marketer? How is this going to make my day-to-day easier? How is this going to help me do anything that you just said at the beginning? And we're going to get to that shortly. Believe me, this process has helped our clients clarify their communication strategies and build much more effective campaigns. I just want to lay the groundwork before we get too far into it. All right, so before we start specifically talking about inputs, I want to really quickly show you guys some of the tools that we're going to be using today, and we're going to be providing you links to at the end of this video. First, we're going to take a look at a really cool tool. We use it all the time at Rooted called real-time boards. If you've ever done any sort of like post-it notes on whiteboard exercises, this is basically what we're looking at here. Real-time is free to use. And at the end of the video, I'll actually send you a template that we created here that you see on the screen that you can copy and do this exercise for yourself. So you'll see here that as we scroll through, it's a little bit jumpy, but as we scroll through, you see the different levels of our logic model. We have our strategies, we have our inputs, we have our outputs, outcomes at the top, and then finally our blue sky statement. These boards are really helpful in terms of brainstorming and organizing thoughts. The second tool I've got here is our Google Sheets, and again, we will send you a link to this. This is a really great place to start with brainstorming. If you want to do this on your own, it's a really great place to start, and there's some instructions in there. All right, so these are some of the tools that we're going to use today. We use them with our clients all the time, and we're going to give you links to those tools so that you have an opportunity to use them internally with your team and make sure that your logic model is working for you. With that, let's jump right into CART's inputs, and we'll talk a little bit more about the activities and inputs that are taking place at their organization. All right, so first off, let's just talk about what an input is. Inputs, or activities as we call them here, are the things that we do or your organization does every day to make your mission run. Okay, so in the case of CART, here are a couple examples of what they do. Remember that this is a volunteer organization. So one of the activities that they do on a day-to-day basis is recruit volunteers. The organization needs volunteers to participate in their cleanup and restoration process. A second thing that they do is they need to actually go out and scout and acquire sites where they can clean up. These sites aren't just coming out of nowhere. They need to find abandoned sites, get permission to work on them, and then set up the logistics to actually do the work. So site acquisition and scouting is a really important thing that they do. Number 3 is volunteer crew leader training. CART can't just rely on groups of volunteers to go out to these sites and kind of bum around on their own. They actually need leaders that are going to provide some really critical guidance, structure, safety, to make sure that it's an enjoyable and productive atmosphere for volunteers. Finally, we have our plant nursery where CART is actually growing the native plant species that they're using to restore the ecosystems and the locations that they're cleaning up. Now we're going to take a look at what we call the real-time board. This is a really interesting tool that we use all the time with our clients. And this template that we created is what we're going to send to you at the end of this video. So let's dig into this a little bit. What you're seeing here is actually the logic model that we have created. In orange, you see that we've added in the inputs that we were just talking about. And you'll be able to see as we go through this exercise how those inputs relate to the strategies, outputs, and outcomes. Right now, we're really going to focus on just the inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And afterwards, we're going to go back and start to talk about the strategies. All right, so at this point, it might be worth taking a second to think about what the activities are for your organization. What are the things that happen on a day-to-day basis in order to make sure that your mission is successful? Okay, next we're going to talk about outputs, but before we do, I actually just want to touch on a topic really quickly because the difference between outputs and outcomes is a really important concept to get to make sure that your logic model is going to help you generate better marketing messaging. It can be a little bit confusing, but I want to walk you through it. Put simply, outputs tell a story of what your organization produces. It doesn't really address impact. It doesn't talk about how it affects communities. It only talks about what your organization produces. On the other hand, outcomes really talk about achievement or impact or the way in which your clients or your community that you serve is being affected. So here, if we talk about some examples, an example of CART's outputs would be the volunteer leader training program generated 5 new volunteer crew leads. An example of an outcome would be that CART is expanding its cleanup program to 2 new regions and doubling the number of acres, 5,000 acres, let's just say, cleaned up and restored. So here's another way to kind of look at it, and I said it, but it's really important to drive home this concept. So take out some way that you're taking notes and write this down. Outcomes communicate impact, whereas outputs are direct results from your activities. Now that we have a better understanding of the difference between outputs and outcomes, I want to walk you through a couple examples of some of the outputs that CART has produced. So remember, number 1, our activity was volunteer recruitment. The output for that is directly related to it. It's volunteers itself. Secondly, our activity or input was site scouting. The output for that is actually clean up sites that are acquired. Number 3, our input or activity was crew leader training, and the output is actually volunteer crew leaders produced. And finally, our activity was plant nursery, and our output is actually going to be native plants. So hopefully this is starting to make sense, and you're starting to see how outputs are actually directly related to your inputs or activities. I want to take a second now to take a look at what this looks like on the real-time board. And you can see here that our inputs or activities, remember, were in orange, and you can see how they directly relate to outputs, which are in the light blue above. We've got arrows that kind of connect the two, so you can start to see that direct relationship. So take a second to think about what are the different outputs that the activities at your organization are creating. Now that we understand outputs, let's start to take a look at outcomes for CART. And one of the things that's really important to note about outcomes is that oftentimes multiple outputs can lead to a particular outcome. Remember, think about the idea of impact and that multiple outputs can create one impact. There's not always a one-to-one connection like we saw in the inputs and outputs area. So let's take a look at some of the examples for CART. Number one is that restored native habitat and ecosystems lead to a clean drinking water sources for nearby population centers. Okay, again, really focusing on the impact. Number two is that community members feel empowered to take a leading role in cleaning up and advocating for their local ecosystems. Again, notice how outcomes are specifically focused on impact to clients or communities. We're really trying to drive home the concept that outcomes focus on impact, outputs, again, really just focus on results. So there are two really important elements to outcomes. First, they are closely related to generating marketing messaging, which produces better marketing campaigns, and that's really important. We'll dig into this shortly, but we're starting to get a lot closer to the concept of how we build better marketing campaigns. Okay, and then secondly, outcomes are really important in terms of measuring. And when we generate marketing impact statements, measuring is extremely important. So I just want to kind of walk you through two examples of why outcomes and measuring outcomes actually generates better impact statements. So let's take a look at a few impact statements or marketing messages that we generated. The first one doesn't really include any sort of measurement in it. In 2018, CART empowered community volunteers to restore abandoned industrial waste sites and help restore the quality of drinking water. All right, that's pretty good. Doesn't really tell you too much, and quite frankly, it could represent an organization that's just starting or an organization that's really established. So let's compare that to, in 2018, CART empowered 20,000 community volunteers to restore more than 1,200 square miles of abandoned industrial waste sites. That's the size of Rhode Island, and helped restore the quality of drinking water to over 1 million people. Now, to me, that has a lot more impact to it. It really gets your attention and drives home the point of the scale and scope of your work. So you can see here how, as we're starting to talk about outcomes, we're really starting to dig into the concept of marketing messaging, but also remember the importance of measuring your outcomes. One of the things that I just want to take a second to point out here is the relationship between outcomes and activities. We talked a little bit about activities or inputs. We've also talked about outputs and outcomes. But when you look at our real-time board here, you can really start to see how inputs flow through and are related to the actual outcomes of your organization. One kind of requires the other. You can see that if you were able to start ramping up the inputs, that you could also see eventually that those outputs would start to increase, and eventually those outcomes or those impact numbers would also start to increase. The reason that I bring this up is that as marketers, a lot of times we can control the actual inputs and activities through our marketing campaigns. And as you see them move through this logic model system, those marketing activities can then affect outputs as well as outcomes. Now that we understand that relationship, it's really important, and we can start to turn towards strategies. One of the things that makes our logic model unique and the framework that we work within unique is that it really focuses on strategies. And this is important when we think about the logic model as an organizational operations model versus turning it into a communications tool, which is how we view it. Now that we know the inputs, we understand the relationship between inputs and outcomes, we can start to build communication strategies around them, and most importantly, prioritize them. So really, activities and inputs actually inform our strategies and how we choose to market to people. And when we're building strategies, it's important to think about the audiences that we're talking to. So who are they? What are the messages that are going to affect them and engage them? And where can we find them? What marketing channel is going to be most effective in terms of finding those people? Let's talk through an example now of what the difference might be for strategies when comparing recruiting volunteers and the way that you might acquire or scout for cleanup sites. When you're acquiring cleanup sites, your organization really is interfacing probably with local government officials or industry business leaders to get permission for those sites. On the other hand, volunteer recruitment may be targeting college kids at nearby schools or maybe retirees. So you can understand how the strategies for these two inputs would be very different. So let's continue with these audience assumptions for a second and talk about the volunteer recruitment strategy, really focusing in on college kids as being the demographic. So what about something like, we're utilizing social media advertising targeting younger adults? So a strategy may be digital advertising and online signups. It may also be something like tabling at college events or just providing general education material about some of the industrial waste that's in the local area. Some of the messaging that you might be using would be something like gaining skills that they can use in the professional world, or just positioning themselves as a leader in the college community and something that recruiters or people that are looking for employees might see as a great quality. In contrast, let's talk a little bit about site acquisition work because it's really a different strategy altogether. So remember, our audience is more focused on government and maybe business leaders. Some of the channels are going to be probably one-on-one discussions, one-on-one presentations, town halls, lobbying, and thought leadership. So positioning your organization as one of the organizations that's really leading the charge. And the messaging is going to be quite different also when we're talking about more community-based or policy empowerment of your community, that environmental health equals healthy communities. So you can start to see here how those strategies are really different and play out very differently about how you might approach these. Let's take a second to go back to our real-time board and take a look at what these strategies look like and how they inform our inputs. You can see how multiple strategies contribute to our inputs. This is really important to realize because there's not necessarily one strategy that's going to inform or empower those inputs. There are multiple ways to achieve our activities or inputs. I want to get back to that question that we've been asking the whole time. How does the logic model make our marketing campaigns more effective? And one of the ways in which it does is when we're talking about what we call the blue sky statement. This lives at the very top of our logic model. So when we talk about blue sky, we're really talking about, as communication professional, how important a vision statement can be. They help connect the audiences to the why. And by that, I mean, why does your organization exist? And if you've ever heard of Simon Sinek, you know this. If you haven't heard of Simon Sinek, Google Simon Sinek, The Power of Why. The concept really being that answering why is actually one of the most important things that you can do as a communications professional. If individuals can't connect with you on a visceral level, then they're never going to get behind the way that you operate as an organization. This is why the blue sky statement is probably one of the most important parts of your organization and of your vision. So this is all to say that the blue sky statement is really critical to establishing the vision for your organization and getting people behind that vision and the work that you're doing. Let's talk a little bit about how this logic model helps you prioritize your communications work as well. As I said at the beginning, this model will allow you to make sure that the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis, is really driving results rather than running around putting out fires. Because we know the relationship between inputs and outputs, we know what strategies and inputs are priority based on your organizational goals, right? Let's imagine a situation where CART has a goal to double the number of acres that they can clean up in 2 years. To do this, obviously, the first thing that they need to do is acquire more cleanup sites. Now that we understand our organizational logic model, we know that in order to ramp up sites, we need to do more outreach with local government officials and different business leaders. We know that we need to implement campaign strategies and generate communications tools that our site recruitment team can use during the big push to acquire more sites. We're starting to see now how the logic model helps us prioritize the work that we're doing as marketers. But let's take a deeper dive into how the logic model actually helps us measure impact and why it's important to measure impact. Here are a couple of ways that we recommend organizations start to measure some of the impact. So number one, describe the outcomes that you want to achieve. Why are you performing your service, or why is your mission important in the first place? Turn those identified outcomes into quantitative measures. So for the purpose of CART, let's talk about the number of acres that have been restored. Let's talk about the amount of water in population regions that has had reduced pollution. Let's talk about the number of volunteers that are engaged at a community level and are advocating for a cleaner environment. Number three, confirm that your desired outcomes are actually linked to your outputs or activities. Right? So how do we make that connection? Number four, actually implement these measures and start to track them. So for a lot of people, that might look like analytics that come out of your website. It might look like something that comes out of your CRM, like Salesforce, but it's really important to find a way that we can actually quantify and measure and continue to track those measurements. And then finally, use that data to demonstrate and increase your success, right? We talked about it before, demonstrating it through messaging. You can demonstrate it through graphical elements, through storytelling. It's really important that once you are measuring it, to use that to help move your mission forward. Okay, so let's go back to that original question that we started with. How does the logic model make our marketing campaigns more effective? How does it make us more powerful as marketers? How does it make our jobs easier? So let's start to summarize here. Basically, by now you should see that the logic model helps us clarify not only our messaging, but who we're talking to and why we're doing it in the first place, okay? Clarity is a really important part of communications, and once you have clarity about why you're doing it, who you should be talking to, it becomes much easier to have effective marketing campaigns. So let's summarize. Number one, the logic model prioritizes our marketing campaigns to generate inputs in line with our organizational goals, right? So the example there was that we talked about prioritizing and focusing campaigns based on the order of outputs you need to succeed. We also talked about focusing on specific tools and strategies based on the audiences that you need to talk to generate those inputs. So we talked, remember, about volunteers versus site acquisitions. That's going to help you prioritize your marketing campaigns. Number two is outcomes generate better messaging. We talked about how outcomes should be measured to generate better messaging. We also talked about how outcomes focus on impact, and impact is what's really going to drive our audiences to connect with us. It's what's going to drive them to support us, and ultimately it's going to drive them to be loyal to us in the long run. And finally, number three, we talked about blue sky statements in the way that they help acquire and build loyal supporters. Remember, we talked about how blue sky statements answer the question of why. Why do you exist? Why should people even care? Why should they engage with you? And remember, once people get behind the concept of why with your organization, it's very easy for them to follow in the how and become very loyal supporters. Hopefully by now this model is starting to make a lot of sense to you, and you can start to see how the operations of your programs and your organization connect really closely with the type of messaging and the types of campaigns that you need to generate as a marketer. So let's talk a little bit about next steps. Definitely go to rootid.com/logic-model, and you're going to be able to download that template that I talked about, our real-time board. The second thing that I'd recommend that you do is start to research and take a look at persona development. Personas are the way that you start to define the audiences and group them together by their motivations. So some people are motivated by things like storytelling, some people are motivated by things like data. So start to look into, and we'll send you some additional information about how you can start to research more and start to develop your own persona models. And then lastly, if you want to reach out, you have questions or just want to chat, feel free to hit me up at andrew@rootid.com, or on Twitter, check us out at getrooted.com. Thank you guys so much for your time today. Hope it was really useful, and let us know what you think.